Listen, can you hear that? The rain. It's been coming down for hours now, steady against the window. The kind of rain that has no intention of stopping before morning. There's a particular comfort in being warm and dry while the rain works away at the glass, isn't there? A sense of being held, of being inside, safe and still, while the night does whatever the night does out there in the dark. The rain doesn't ask anything of you. It just falls patient and endless, and all you have to do is lie here and listen to it and let it carry you down. The people in tonight's stories knew that feeling too. They worked the night shift, all of them, the long hours that the rest of the world sleeps through. The security guard alone in an office building meant for hundreds. The nurse at the far end of a quiet ward. The man in the toll booth on an empty road in the middle of nowhere. The girl behind the counter of an all-night petrol station. The engineer deep in a basement full of machinery. The cleaner moving alone through a darkened museum. They knew the rain, and they knew the particular loneliness of being awake and at work while everyone else in the world is asleep. There's a kind of person who's suited to that life, who finds peace in the empty hours. Each of the people in tonight's stories was that kind of person, and each of them, on one specific rainy night, found out that the night shift is not always as empty as it looks. I have 6 stories for you tonight. 6 true accounts, or as true as these things ever are, told slow and low, with the rain falling all the way through to carry you gently down into sleep. There's nothing here that will jolt you awake, nothing that jumps out, just a slow, quiet dread, the kind that creeps in around the edges of a long, wet, lonely night, the kind you can turn over comfortably in your mind as you drift off. So turn the lights down, pull the blanket up to your chin, let the rain do its work on the window. And if you happen to drift off somewhere in the middle of a story, that's perfectly all right. You don't have to hear the end. The stories will keep going without you, the way the night shift always does, the way the rain always does, whether anyone's awake to listen or not. Let's begin. Story 1. We'll start with a man whose whole job all night long was simply to watch. A security guard alone in a great empty office building with nothing to do through the small hours but walk the silent floors and look at the screens. He'd done it for years. He knew exactly what those screens were supposed to show him. And one rainy night, they started showing him something they shouldn't have. I worked building security for almost 11 years, and for most of that time I worked nights, because the night shift paid a little more, and because honestly, I liked the quiet. People think a security job must be exciting, full of intruders and alarms and drama. It isn't. It's the opposite of exciting almost all of the time, and that is exactly what I liked about it. You do your rounds. You come back and sit at your desk. You watch the monitors, you do your rounds again, hour after hour after hour. The building empties out around 6 in the evening as the day staff go home, and by 8 o'clock it's just you and the hum of the air conditioning and the little red and green lights on the alarm panels and the great weight of the empty building above you. I found it peaceful, genuinely peaceful. Some people can't stand to be alone with nothing but their own thoughts for 8 hours at a stretch. It would drive them mad. I never minded. I think I needed it in those years. The quiet suited something in me. The building I want to tell you about was a corporate office tower, 12 floors of glass and steel. The kind of place where a few thousand people work all day, and absolutely no one at all is supposed to be at night, except me. My station was down in the main lobby, a big curved desk facing a bank of monitors that showed the camera feeds from all over the building, maybe 20 of them, cycling through different angles every minute or two. The lobby itself, the parking garage below, the elevator banks, the long corridors on each of the 12 floors, the loading dock around the back. I knew those feeds, the way you know the back of your own hand. I'd stared at them for years. I knew exactly what an empty corridor looked like at 3 in the morning. The precise gray stillness of it, because I had looked at empty corridors at 3 in the morning more times than any person should ever have to. Nothing ever happened on them. That was the point. That was the job, to watch the nothing and make sure it stayed nothing. This particular night, it was raining hard. I remember that very clearly, because the rain running down the big lobby windows made the whole glass front of the building ripple and shift, the street lights outside smearing and blurring across it, and every now and then a car would hiss past on the wet road and throw a long streak of moving light across the polished lobby floor. It was the kind of night that makes you deeply glad to be inside, dry and warm, with a hot coffee at your elbow. I'd done my 10 o'clock round through the building and my midnight round, and everything had been exactly as it always was. Quiet, empty, locked. I came back down, settled in at the desk with my coffee, and watched the monitors cycle through their patient loop, the rain drumming softly against the glass behind me. It was around 2 in the morning when I first noticed something on the feed from the 9th floor. Just a flicker, right at the edge of the frame. In a second or two, that particular camera was up in the cycle before it switched to the next. I didn't think much of it. Old cameras flicker, insects crawl across the lenses. A reflection catches and moves. But the next time that 9th floor feed came around in the cycle, maybe 90 seconds later, I found myself looking for it on purpose, watching that specific monitor, waiting for the angle to come up. And when it did, there it was again. At the very far end of the 9th floor corridor, down where the emergency lighting barely reached, in the dark, something was standing. Just standing there. Still, now, I want to be clear about how I thought about this in the moment. Because 11 years on the job teaches you to stay calm and reach for the ordinary explanation first. My first thought was not a ghost. Of course it wasn't. My first thought was that somebody had simply stayed late, worked into the evening, fallen asleep at their desk, and was now finally waking up, disoriented, wandering out to find the elevators and go home. It happened, not often, but it happened 2 or 3 times a year maybe. So I did the normal, sensible thing. I picked up the radio out of pure habit, even though there was no one to call, and then I set it back down and I leaned in toward the monitor and I watched. I watched to see which way the person would move so that I could go up and meet them at the elevator and walk them out of the building. The way I'd done a dozen times before for sleepy, late-working strangers. But the figure didn't go toward the elevator. It didn't move toward anything. It simply stood there, at the dark end of the corridor, at the very limit of where the camera could see, and it did not move at all. And the longer I watched it, the less it looked like a tired worker who nodded off at their desk, and the more it looked like a person who was standing perfectly, deliberately still, facing down the corridor, facing the camera, facing it began to feel me. I did what the job required. I got up. I clipped on my radio and took my heavy flashlight, and I went to check it out. Because that is what you're there to do. The elevator ride up to the 9th floor felt much longer than 9 floors should feel. I remember watching the little numbers climb above the door, 1 to 2 to 3, and feeling for the first time in a very long time in that building that I would genuinely rather be almost anywhere else in the world. The door slid open onto the 9th floor, and I stepped out into the dark. The emergency lighting was on, that dim green-tinged glow that office buildings have at night, just enough to make out the shapes of things. I called out, the way you do. Hello, security. Is anyone up here? My voice sounded thin and small in all that empty, carpeted office space, swallowed up by the dark and the distant sound of the rain against the windows. I walked the length of that corridor, all the way down to the far end, the end where the figure had been standing, and there was nothing there. Of course there was nothing there. There was a tall window looking out over the city, and a potted plant in the corner, and the rain running in long silver lines down the outside of the glass, and the blurred and scattered lights of the sleeping city far below. No person, and importantly, no place for a person to have gone. The corridor ended there at the window. To leave anyone standing there would have had to walk back up the corridor, the way I had just come, and past me, and no one had come past me. I stood at that window feeling foolish and relieved in roughly equal measure, and I told myself firmly that it had been a shadow, a trick of the rain light moving and shifting on the dark glass, a reflection, nothing. And I turned around and walked back to the elevator and rode it down to the lobby, and the figure was on the monitor again. Same place, 9th floor. The far end of the corridor, standing in the dark, exactly where I had been standing not 3 minutes earlier, exactly where I had just confirmed with my own eyes, with my own hand on that cold window glass, that there was nothing and no one at all. I sat down at my desk very slowly. I did not pick up the coffee. I watched it, and it watched me, or it watched the camera, which from where I sat felt like precisely the same thing. We watched each other down 9 floors of empty building and a length of cable, the rain falling between us on every window in the place. And then, as I watched, it moved. For the first time, it moved, but not toward the elevator. It turned, slowly, unhurried, and it walked the other way, away from the camera, deeper into the dark of the 9th floor, into the part of the corridor that the camera could not see, and it was gone. I would like to tell you that I went back up there to investigate properly, like a brave man, like a professional. I did not. I sat at that lobby desk and I watched the 9th floor feed every single time it came around in the cycle, all night long until the gray light of morning came up behind the rain, and I never saw the figure again. When the morning relief came in at 6, yawning, shaking out his wet umbrella, the sun was struggling up somewhere behind the clouds, and the rain had finally eased to a drizzle, and the whole thing already felt distant and a little silly in the ordinary light of a new day. I went home. I slept. I almost convinced myself I dreamed it, but here is the part I still think about all these years later. The following week, I mentioned it to one of the daytime guards, an older fellow who'd been with the building far longer than me. I said it lightly, half as a joke, the way you do when you're testing whether you can say a thing out loud without sounding mad. I said, "You ever see anything strange up on the 9th floor at night?" And he didn't laugh. That was the first thing. He didn't laugh at all. He got a careful, closed sort of look on his face, and he asked me one question. He asked, "Which end?" And I said the far end by the window. And he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when you've just confirmed something he already knew but had hoped you wouldn't say. And he told me quietly that years before my time, before I ever set foot in that building, a man who worked up on the 9th floor had stayed very late one night, alone after everyone else had gone home, and that he had not in the end gone home himself. He didn't say it any more plainly than that. He didn't need to. He just said by the window. He always did like the view from that window. And then he picked up his keys and went off to do his morning rounds, and we never spoke of it again. Not once in all the time we worked together. I stayed in that building another 2 years. And in those 2 years, I never once volunteered to take a call up on the ninth floor at night. And somehow it never came up. Somehow it was never a problem, as if everyone there already knew and had quietly agreed long ago simply to leave the ninth floor to him. Story 2. From an empty office building to a busy hospital, though at night. In the small hours, a hospital can feel just as hollow and just as vast. This next one comes from a nurse working the overnight shift on a quiet ward. The kind of shift where the hardest part is usually just staying awake until dawn, until the night a patient in an empty room, a room with no one in it at all, began ringing the call bell. I trained as a nurse when I was young, and I worked in hospitals for most of my working life. And I'll tell you something that everyone who has done it knows, and that no one who hasn't done it ever quite believes. The night shift in a hospital is its own separate world. The daytime hospital, the one everyone pictures, full of visitors and doctors and trolleys rattling down the corridors, and the constant bright noise of it all that hospital goes to sleep at night. And underneath it, in the quiet, the night hospital wakes up, quieter, dimmer, slower, stranger. You learn working nights for long enough that hospitals at 3 in the morning have a particular feeling to them, a particular atmosphere that they simply do not have in the daylight hours. It's not frightening most of the time. It's just different, heavier. And most nurses who have worked nights for any length of time have a story, one strange thing they can't quite explain. Most of us never tell them, partly because who would believe us, and partly, honestly, because you don't want to dwell on these things when you have to walk back onto that same dim ward the very next night and do it all over again. But I'll tell you mine here in the dark with the rain coming down. It feels like the right place for it. I was working a ward, geriatric care mostly, elderly patients on the overnight shift. It was a long ward, the old-fashioned kind rooms running down both sides of a central corridor. And at night there would be just 2 or 3 of us on duty, sitting at the nurse's station in the middle of it all, watching the board and listening for anyone who needed us. The board was the heart of it, a panel of small lights, one for each room, and when a patient pressed their call button, the button on the little handset clipped to the rail of their bed, their light would come on, and a soft chime would sound at the station. And you'd get up and go down the corridor and see what they needed. A glass of water, help to the bathroom, something for the pain, and sometimes, often, in the night, just a frightened, confused old person who'd woken in the dark and forgotten where they were and wanted more than anything, simply to know that someone was there. That part was a bigger piece of the job than most people realize, just being present, just being the person who comes when you call, in the long, frightening dark of a hospital night. It was raining hard the night I want to tell you about, really coming down, drumming steadily on the roof of the ward, which was a low old building, so you really heard the weather up there close overhead. I always rather liked working in the rain. It made the ward feel snug somehow, sealed off and safe. The warm pool of light at the nurse's station against all that wet darkness pressing in at the windows. My one colleague on that stretch had gone off on her break down to the canteen, so for about half an hour in the deep middle of the night it was just me alone at the station, working through some paperwork, half my mind on the forms and half of it drifting along with the sound of the rain. The chime sounded. I looked up at the board, and the light was on for room 14, and I remember feeling a small, mild flicker of surprise, because room 14 was empty. The elderly woman who had been in it had been discharged that very afternoon, sent home well again, and the room had not yet been cleaned and filled with anyone new. It was standing empty, and an empty room I knew perfectly well, does not ring its own call bell. So my first thought, the sensible, tired 3 in the morning thought, was simply that the call button in there had developed a fault. They did that sometimes, the older handsets, a little short in the worn old wiring, and they would chime away on their own for no reason. A nuisance, nothing more. I made a mental note to report it to maintenance, reset the call from the panel at the station, and went back to my paperwork. A minute later, perhaps less, it chimed again. Room 14. I looked up, sighed, and reset it again, a little more irritated now, because a faulty button chiming all night would drive me to distraction. And I decided that the simplest thing would be to go down to room 14 myself and just unplug the wretched handset at the wall so that it couldn't chime again and disturb me. Or worse, wake the sleeping patients in the rooms on either side. So I got up from the warm station and I walked off down the dim corridor, past the closed doors of the sleeping patients, the rain loud and steady on the roof above me, all the way down to room 14. The door was standing open, the way we always leave the empty rooms. I reached in around the frame and found the switch and turned on the light. The room was empty, just as it should have been. The bed stripped down to a bare blue mattress, the way the housekeeping staff leave them between patients. The locker empty, the chair pushed neatly into the corner, and the call button, the little handset on its long curling cord that clips onto the rail of the bed, was not clipped to the rail where it belonged. It was lying on the pillow, up at the head of that stripped and empty bed, resting on the bare pillow, exactly, precisely where it would be lying if a patient were propped up in that bed holding it loosely in their hand. I stood in the doorway, and I looked at that for a long moment. The call handset resting on the pillow of an empty bed in an empty room, and I told myself, of course, that housekeeping must have left it there when they stripped the bed, that it had simply been set down and forgotten, that there was a perfectly ordinary reason. And I crossed the room to pick it up and unplug it from the wall and be done with the whole business. And while it was in my hand, it pressed. I felt it. The button on the end of the handset went down, click, under pressure, except that my thumb was nowhere near the button. My hand was wrapped around the middle of the handset, the way you'd grab it to pull the plug, and the button is set into the very end of it, facing away from your grip, and I felt it depress, felt the small firm click of it under no finger at all. And an instant later, from back down the corridor at the empty station, I heard the soft, clear chime sound out into the quiet ward. I put it down. I believe I put it down very gently and very quickly, the way you'd set down something that had turned out to be far hotter than you expected. And I stood there in that empty room, with the rain hammering down on the roof just above my head. And I had the strongest feeling I have ever had in my life, before or since. An absolute bone-deep certainty that I was not alone in that room, that there was someone in the bed, that if I were only to turn my head just slightly, just a few degrees to my right, I would see them. An old patient, propped up against the pillow, looking at me with a patient, mild, faintly puzzled expression, wondering, perhaps, why on earth it had taken me so very long to come when they had called and called and called. I did not turn my head. I want you to understand that I have wondered every day since whether I should have, whether someone needed me and I failed them. But in that moment every instinct I had told me simply do not look, and I did not. I walked straight out of that room, and I left the light on, which we never ever do, and I went back down the long corridor to the bright, safe island of the nurse's station, and I sat down. And when my colleague came back up from her break a few minutes later, she took one look at me and stopped, and asked me what on earth was the matter, because I was, she told me afterward, sitting bolt upright and white as the bed sheets, and I just said, "The call button in room 14 is faulty. Would you log it for maintenance?" And she frowned, and she looked up at the board, and she looked back at me, and she said very gently, "14's been quiet all night, love. There's nothing showing on 14." And I looked up at the board myself, at the long row of little lights, and the light for room 14 was dark, and it stayed dark all the rest of that long night until the morning came. I asked, a few nights later, as carefully and as casually as I could manage, one of the older nurses, a woman who'd been on that ward for the better part of 20 years and had seen everything. I asked her who had been in room 14 before the woman who'd just been discharged, the patient before her, and she thought about it, and she told me a name, an old gentleman who had been with us a long while, weeks and weeks, slowly fading, near the very end of a long life. And she smiled a little, sadly, and said he'd been a lovely man. No trouble to anyone, gentle as could be, but that he had been frightened of the dark, at the end the way some of them are, frightened of being alone in the night, and that he would ring his call bell, not for anything in particular, not for water or for pain, but just to have someone come and sit with him for a minute, just to have a bit of company, just so as not to be alone in the dark, and that he had passed away, in that room, in that bed, on a wet night not unlike this one, in the rain. I never told a single soul what had happened to me in that room. But I will tell you this, for the rest of my years on that ward, whenever room 14 stood empty between patients, I made a small habit at the very start of each night shift of putting my head in around the door and saying quietly into the dark, just so he would know I'm here. "If you need me, I'm here tonight. You're not alone." And I never once heard that chime sound from an empty room again, not in all the years that followed, and I have come to believe in the time since that it was truly all he ever wanted, not to frighten anyone, not to be found, just to know in the dark that someone would still come when he called, that someone was still there. Story 3. Now we go out of doors, out onto the open road, late at night, to a place that almost all of us have driven past 1,000 times without ever once giving it a second thought. A toll booth on a long, lonely stretch of motorway, where a single man sat through the night in a little lit box in the middle of the dark, taking coins from the few cars that passed, and where, one filthy rainy night, a car came rolling through that he has never, in all the years since, been able to explain away. This was a long time ago. You understand, back before they automated nearly all the toll booths, back when there was still a living person sitting in the booth to take your money and lift the barrier and wave you through. I did that job for a couple of years when I was a young man, on a stretch of motorway that ran for miles and miles through empty open country. And I worked the overnight shift, midnight through to 8 in the morning. It is genuinely hard to explain to people nowadays just how isolated that work was. You are sealed inside this little booth of glass and concrete, lit up bright as day on the inside so that you can see to handle the money in the till, which means that you yourself are essentially a glowing fishbowl, perfectly visible from a long way off, while all around you, beyond the glass, is nothing but darkness. The motorway stretching away dead straight in both directions into a blackness that the booth lights couldn't begin to touch. And for long, long stretches of the deep night, there would be no cars at all. None. Just you, and the hum of the lights, and the moan of the wind across the open country. And on a night like the one I'm thinking of, the rain, you'd get the occasional vehicle, of course, a big lorry grinding through on a long-haul run, A lone late traveler, someone driving through the night to reach somewhere by the morning. But between about 2 and 5 in the morning, the dead heart of the shift, it was mostly just empty. You'd sit there with a paperback or the radio turned down low, and you would wait. And every so often a pair of headlights would appear far, far down the road. Two tiny points of light growing slowly larger. And I'll be honest with you, you would feel almost grateful for the company. Even if it was only 10 seconds of some bleary stranger fumbling coins into your hand without a word before they pulled away and vanished back into the dark. Even that was something. Even that was another human being, awake in the night, sharing the road with you for a moment. The night I want to tell you about was a truly filthy one. The rain was coming down in great sweeping sheets, and the wind was throwing it sideways against the booth so hard that the glass shuddered with it, and I could barely make out the road beyond my own pool of light. It was around 3 in the morning, the very dead middle of the shift, when I saw the headlights coming. Just the one set, far off down the motorway, approaching my booth, and I watched them come the way you always did, with that small flicker of bored interest, any car being a little event in all that emptiness. But something about these particular headlights bothered me, and it took me a moment, watching them, to work out exactly what it was. They were coming very slowly, far, far more slowly than anyone ever drives on a motorway, even in heavy rain, even being cautious, crawling almost, and they were weaving, just slightly drifting gently across the lane, and then drifting back. Across and back the way a car moves when the driver behind the wheel is very, very tired, or very drunk, or somehow not entirely in control of the machine at all. The car came on, slow and weaving through the downpour, and at last it reached my booth and rolled to a stop at the barrier. And in the light I could see it properly, and it was an old car, older than anything you would ever expect to see out on the road, even back then. The kind of model you only really saw in old photographs, all rounded fenders and chrome streaming with rain. And I sat there in my warm lit booth, and I waited, as you do, for the window to wind down, for the hand to come out with the coins, for the brief flat exchange of a few words, and the lifting of the barrier, the 10 little seconds of human contact. But the window did not come down. The car simply sat there at the barrier, its engine running, its old headlights burning, the rain pouring over the roof and the bonnet and streaming down the glass, and nothing happened. Nothing at all. I leaned forward toward my own window, peering out through the rain, and I could see the driver, a man sitting upright behind the wheel, both his hands resting on it at 10 and 2, looking straight ahead through the windscreen out past the barrier at the empty road beyond. He was not looking at me. He was not reaching for any money. He was not doing any of the things that a person stopped at a toll booth does. He was simply sitting there, perfectly still, staring forward, his face lit up a strange flat gray-white by the light spilling from my booth. The rain running down the windscreen between us in such thick streams that his features seemed to ripple and blur and run, like a face seen underwater. I tapped on my own window glass to get his attention. I called out to him loud enough to carry through 2 panes of glass and the roar of the rain. "The toll, please, sir. The toll." He did not move. He did not so much as flicker. He did not turn his head a single degree toward me. He just kept on staring forward, out through that streaming windscreen, both hands on the wheel, and on his face was the most terrible expression I have ever seen on any human being. I have tried many times over many years to describe that expression to myself, to find the right word for it, and the closest I have ever come is this. He looked lost. Not confused, exactly, lost. lost in the very deepest possible sense of that word, like a man who genuinely did not know where he was, nor how he had come to be there, nor where in the world he was meant to be going. Like a man who had been driving alone down a dark, wet road for a very, very long time indeed, longer than you can imagine, and who had, somewhere along the way, forgotten why. And then, while I sat frozen there staring at him, it happened. Without the window ever coming down, without the man ever once turning to look at me or speaking a single word, or paying a single coin, the barrier in front of his car lifted, all by itself. I want to be as clear about this as I possibly can be, because in the years since I have gone over this moment 10,000 times in my mind, my hand was nowhere near the control. I had not touched the button. It was not an accident, not a slip, not a malfunction I could blame on faulty wiring. The barrier simply rose smoothly on its own, as though some other hand entirely had reached out and lifted it, and the old car rolled slowly forward beneath the raised barrier, still weaving very faintly from side to side, and it continued on up the dark motorway, its red taillights dwindling, smaller and smaller, into the rain and the blackness, until at last they were gone, and the road was empty again. And it was only me alone in my little box of light, with my heart pounding in my chest. I sat there for a long, long moment, just staring at the empty road where the car had gone. And then I picked up the phone, the internal line that connected my booth to the central supervisor's office that oversaw all the booths up and down that stretch of road. And I tried, stammering, to explain what had just happened, that a car had come through without paying, that the barrier had risen on its own, with no one touching it. And the man on the other end of the line was quiet for a moment, and then, instead of answering my report, he asked me a question. He asked me what time it was, and I looked at the clock and told him just gone 3 in the morning, and he was quiet again. A longer pause this time, and then he said something to me that I have never in my life forgotten. He said, "You're new on this stretch, aren't you, son?" And I said, "Yes, I was only a few weeks." And he said in a flat, tired, matter-of-fact voice, the voice of a man stating something he'd stated many times before, "Don't you worry about the 3 o'clock car. It doesn't pay. It never has paid, and it never will. You just let it through." And then he hung up the phone. I worked that toll booth for another 1.5 years after that night, and in all that time, perhaps a handful of times, never more, always on the very worst and wildest of nights, always at around 3 in the morning, always in the driving rain. I would look up from my book and see those slow weaving headlights coming up the road toward me out of the dark. And I learned after that first time to do exactly what the supervisor had told me. I would lift the barrier myself, early, with my own hand on the button, before the car ever even reached me, so that it would not have to stop, so that I would not have to sit and wait and look at that man's face through the streaming rain, so that I would never again have to see that lost, hollow, terrible expression. That man, driving forever, alone, up an endless dark motorway in the endless rain, on his way to a place he would never, ever reach, on a road that, for him, poor soul, had no end at all. Story 4. We move now to the strange dead hours in a place that is all light and no people, an all-night petrol station, the kind that sits alone on the edge of a town, where a young woman worked the counter through the small hours to pay her way through college. The rain on the empty forecourt, the hum of the freezers, the bright, lonely island of light in the dark. And one rainy night, a customer who came in out of the storm and would not leave. I took the job at the petrol station when I was 19, because it fit neatly around my college classes, and the night shift paid a little extra, and it was usually quiet enough that I could sit behind the counter and get my reading done between customers. It was one of those stations that sits all by itself on the very edge of a town, out where the streetlights end, on a main road heading off into the dark of the countryside, the kind with a little shop attached, selling crisps and chocolate and motor oil and tired-looking sandwiches in plastic triangles. And at night, from about 11 o'clock onward, I would be the only person there. Just me behind the counter under the hard white glare of the fluorescent lights, with the steady hum of the big drinks fridges along the wall, and the great dark windows looking out onto the empty forecourt, and the pumps and the black road beyond. I won't pretend it was never eerie, because it was. You're lit up like an actor on a stage, perfectly visible to anyone out there in the night. And yet you yourself can't really see out at all, because all you can see in the dark glass is the bright reflection of the shop and your own face looking back at you. So anyone out there, anyone standing in the dark forecourt or at the edge of the road, could watch you for as long as they liked, and you would never know they were there until they chose to step into the light. But you get used to it. You learn the rhythm of the night the way you do with any night job. The last few drivers heading wearily home, the long, dead, empty stretch in the very middle, the first early lorry drivers and shift workers coming in around 5 for their coffee and their cigarettes. And the rain, when it came, was almost a friend, because heavy rain kept everyone away and gave me long, peaceful hours to myself with my textbooks. This particular night, it was absolutely pouring. Really coming down hard, bouncing up off the concrete of the forecourt, sheeting across the empty pumps and waves, hammering on the flat roof above me. I hadn't had a single customer in well over an hour. I was sitting on my stool behind the counter with a textbook propped open, half reading and half just listening to the rain and letting my mind wander, when the little electronic bell over the door went, its cheerful electronic ding, and someone came in out of the storm. I looked up, and it was a man older, I thought, perhaps in his 60s, wearing a long dark overcoat that, by rights, should have been absolutely soaked through and dripping after even a few seconds out in that downpour, but which somehow looked only faintly, evenly damp. He didn't say anything to me. He didn't look at me at all. He simply came in, slowly, and began to move around the little shop, up one narrow aisle and down the other, looking at the shelves. Now there was nothing strange in that, not in itself. People come in out of the rain all the time, to browse, to get out of the wet for a minute, to buy a hot coffee and warm up. So I said good evening, the way you always do, cheerful and automatic. And he didn't answer me. And even that wasn't really so strange, because plenty of people, lost in their own thoughts at 3 in the morning, don't bother to answer the girl behind the counter. But he didn't leave. That was the thing. He moved slowly up and down the 2 little aisles, looking at the shelves, and minutes went by, and then more minutes, and still he didn't leave. And still he didn't bring anything to the counter, and still he never once looked across at me. I went back to my book, but I kept glancing up the way you do, keeping half an eye on him. And every time I looked up, there he was, in a slightly different part of the shop, moving slowly along the shelves with the very same blank, patient attention, as though he were searching for one specific thing that he simply could not find. Or, and this thought came to me slowly and unpleasantly, as though he weren't really looking at the shelves at all, as though the looking were just something to do, as though he were waiting for something. After maybe 20 minutes of this, 20 long minutes of this silent gray man drifting up and down my aisles in the small hours, I began to feel truly uneasy. And the thing that unsettled me, I realized, was not anything he had done, because he had done nothing. He had not spoken, had not approached me, had not touched a single item on the shelves, had not in any way threatened or troubled me. And precisely that was the problem, because that is not how people behave. People who come in out of the rain buy something and leave, or they warm up for a few minutes and leave, or they at the very least look at you, nod at you, acknowledge that you are a person standing a few feet away from them, are present in the small, ordinary human ways that people are always present. This man did none of it. He just drifted, silent and gray and patient, around and around and around my little shop, and never once looked at me, and never made a single sound that I could hear over the drumming of the rain, not even footsteps. I realized with a slow, cold feeling that I could not hear his footsteps at all. I decided to be brisk and normal about it, to take charge, the way you tell yourself to. I called over to him, a little louder than I needed to, my voice not quite as steady as I'd hoped. "Are you all right over there, sir? Can I help you find anything in particular?" And he stopped. He stopped moving dead still in the middle of the far aisle with his back turned to me, and then, slowly, he turned around to face me. And I want so badly to be able to tell you that there was something monstrous about his face, something rotten or terrible or inhuman, because in a strange way that would have been so much easier to carry afterward. But there wasn't. His face was perfectly ordinary. An old man's tired, gray, lined face. Nothing wrong with it at all, except for the eyes. His eyes were fixed on me, and in them was an expression of such complete, such utter, such bottomless, hollow emptiness that I felt it pass straight through me like a draft of cold water down my spine. There was nothing behind those eyes, no anger, no hunger, no threat, no person. Just a terrible, empty, endless looking. And, as I stared back at him, frozen, he slowly opened his mouth, just slightly, as if he were about to speak to me, to say something, to tell me something, and no sound came out. Nothing at all. He simply stood there in the middle of my shop, his empty eyes fixed on mine, and his mouth slightly open, saying nothing, while the rain came down and down on the roof above us. I reached, very slowly, without taking my eyes off him, for the telephone we kept on a shelf under the counter, and in the very instant that my hand began to move, the lights flickered, just once, the whole shop dimming down to nearly nothing, and then surging back up to full brightness, the way the lights do in an old building during a bad storm. And in that 1/2 second of dimness, he was gone. The aisle where he had been standing was simply empty. The little bell over the door had not rung. The door itself had not opened. Not even a crack. I would have heard it. I would have seen it. The door was right there in plain view a few feet to my left. But he was gone, utterly and completely, as though he had never been standing there at all, as though I had blinked him out of existence. I stood behind that counter with my hand still resting on the telephone for a very long time, my heart slamming against my ribs, staring at the empty aisle and the rain streaming down the black windows. And eventually, slowly, I managed to talk myself down. I was tired. I told myself it had been a long shift, a long week. The rain, the loneliness, the late hour, the white glare of the lights. My own tired mind had simply conjured something up, the way a tired mind will. I finished my shift. I watched the gray dawn come up through the rain. I drove home, and I went to bed, and I told myself firmly that it had been nothing at all. It was a few weeks later, chatting idly with one of the other girls who worked the place, an afternoon shift girl who'd been there a couple of years longer than me, that it all came out. We were just passing the time, and I said, as lightly and as casually as I possibly could, "Has anyone you know ever seen anything a bit odd working here on the night shift on your own?" And she went very quiet. And then she turned and looked at me, and she asked in a careful, low voice, "Did you see the man?" Just that. "Did you see the man?" And I felt the skin on my arms go cold and tight, and I said, "What man? What do you mean, what man?" And she told me quietly that years before either of us had ever worked there, on a stormy night much like the one I'd had, an old man had come into the shop out of the rain and had suffered a sudden massive heart attack right there between the two aisles, and had collapsed and died on the floor of the shop before the ambulance could ever reach him, in the rain. And that ever since then, every so often, only on the very worst and wettest of nights, someone working the night shift alone would look up from their book or their till and find him there. An old man in a long dark coat, moving slowly up and down the aisles, searching the shelves for something he could never find, turning at last to look at me, opening his mouth to speak, and never, ever finding the words. Story 5. Back indoors now and downward, deep underground, to what is surely one of the loneliest night shifts there is anywhere in the world. A man working entirely alone in the control room of a great building's basement, far below the streets, surrounded on every side by humming machinery, with no window and no daylight and no other living soul for company. And on one particular night, a voice on an old intercom, a voice that should not, by any reckoning, have been able to speak to him at all. I worked for many years as a building engineer, which is really just a respectable way of saying that I looked after the hidden guts of a very large building, the boilers, the great ventilation systems, the electrical switchgear, the water pumps, all the heavy, complicated machinery that keeps an enormous modern building alive and breathing and comfortable, and that absolutely no one who works upstairs in the light ever spares a single thought for, right up until the moment it stops working. And a great deal of that machinery lives down in the basement levels, several floors below the street, in a kind of warren of plant rooms and service corridors and stairwells that the thousands of people working up in the offices above never see and never even imagine. I worked the night shift down there, monitoring the systems through the small hours, carrying out maintenance and being on hand, just in case, in the unlikely event that something went badly wrong while the great building slept above me. It was solitary work, the most solitary work I have ever done in my life, before or since. Down in those basement levels, you are below the ground, so there are no windows anywhere. None, not a single one. No sense at all of the outside world. No weather, no sky, no day and no night except for whatever your wristwatch chooses to tell you. There is only the maze of low corridors, the flat buzz of the strip lighting overhead, the constant deep hum and rumble and rhythmic clank of the machinery all around you, felt through the soles of your feet as much as heard. And the heat, it was always warm down there, more than warm, close and thick, the air heavy with the smell of machine oil and hot metal and dust. My base of operations was the main control room, a cramped little space, crammed full of panels and dials and gauges and switches, and on one wall, an old intercom system. An ancient thing, a relic left over from decades back when the building was first built, a grid of buttons and a speaker, connecting the control room to various points and stations scattered all around the building. It was mostly unused now, a museum piece. In all my months down there, I had never once heard it so much as crackle. The night I want to tell you about, I knew it was raining outside only because I had seen it coming down hard on my way into work hours earlier, before I descended into the windowless dark of the basement. Down there, of course, you couldn't hear it or see it or feel it, but I mention it, the rain, because it matters to how this story ends. It was raining hard up at street level all through that night. I was standing at the main control panel sometime around 3 in the morning, working steadily through my routine checks, my mind half elsewhere, when the intercom on the wall crackled. This old, dead, silent intercom that I had never once heard used. It crackled into life. That particular electrical hiss and pop of a speaker line suddenly opening, an active connection coming alive. And then out of the hiss a voice spoke, and it said my name, just my name, quietly, clearly, through the crackle and the hiss of the old speaker. And I stood there, absolutely motionless, and stared at that intercom panel on the wall, because there was no one else in the entire building. No one at all. I knew that for a fact, and there was certainly no one who could possibly be using a decades-old, long-dead intercom system down in the basement at 3 o'clock in the morning to speak my name into the dark. I told myself, with an effort, that it was interference, a crossed wire, the ancient system somehow picking up a stray radio signal from somewhere out in the night, the way old electrical systems sometimes will. I made myself turn back to my checks. My hands, I noticed, were not quite steady. A minute or so later, it crackled again, and the voice said quite clearly, "Are you there?" A pause full of hiss, and then again patient and calm. "Are you there?" A man's voice, low and a little distorted and flattened by the cheap old speaker, but perfectly clear and perfectly understandable. "Are you there?" And against every screaming instinct in my body, because what else in the end do you do? What else can you do? I reached out and I pressed the talk button on the panel, and I said into it, "Who is this?" And there was a pause, a long, long pause, full of nothing but that soft electrical hiss. And then the voice came back, and it said, "I'm down here. Can you come and help me? I'm down here." Now the sensible, rational daylight part of my mind went straight to work. The way it's trained to, perhaps it said, there really is someone in the building. A late worker who'd somehow been locked in, a security problem. Someone who had wandered down into the service areas and become lost or trapped and frightened. The old intercom had stations dotted all over the building, on every floor and in every plant room. So I looked at the panel, at the grid of little stations, to see which one was active, which one was lit up, so that I would know where the voice was coming from, where this person was, where I needed to go to help them. And this is the part of it that I have never in all the years since been able to settle or explain or lay to rest in my own mind. The panel showed me that the active station, the one the voice was coming through, the one lit up and open, was on a sub-basement level, a level below the one I was standing on. And the building, according to every single plan and blueprint and diagram I had ever seen of it, did not have a level below the one I was on. There were storage levels marked below me. Yes, the lowest depths of the building, but the glowing active light sat beside a station number that was lower than any of them, lower than the lowest level, lower than the building was ever supposed to go down into the earth at all. I sat very, very still, and the voice came again, out of the hiss, patient as ever. "Please," it said, "I'm down here. It's so dark down here. Won't you come and help me?" And there was something in the voice now, a new note that hadn't been there before, a note of pleading, of genuine fear, of a terrible aching loneliness that made my chest go tight and my eyes sting because it sounded so real. It sounded exactly like a frightened, suffering person, trapped somewhere down in the cold and the dark, begging for help. And every decent human instinct I had was telling me to go, to get up and find a torch and go down and find this poor soul and help him. And every other instinct I had, the older one, the deeper one, the ancient animal one that lives in the base of your spine and has kept our kind alive through 100,000 dark nights. That instinct was telling me, in a cold, flat voice that allowed no argument whatsoever, do not go down there. Do not go below. Whatever is calling you, there is nothing beneath you that you want to find. Do not answer it. Do not move. I did not answer it. I took my hand away from the talk button, and I sat back, and I stayed silent, and the voice went on for a long while. It went on, patient, and then pleading, and then patient again by turns, saying my name over and over, gently asking why I wasn't coming, asking why I wouldn't help, telling me how dark it was down there, how cold, how very long it had been waiting, all alone in the black. And I sat in that hot, close, humming control room deep beneath the city, and I did not move a muscle, and I did not make a sound, and I did not answer. And at last, after what felt like a very long time indeed, the intercom crackled one final time, and the voice, when it came, was softer than before, almost gentle, almost kind, and it said, "That's all right. That's quite all right. I'll wait." And then the hiss cut off abruptly, and the line went dead, and the old intercom was silent once more. And it stayed silent. I finished out the rest of my shift in that control room without once getting up from my chair, without going out on a single round, until the morning man came down at last to relieve me, whistling, ordinary, blinking in the strip light. And when I climbed the long stairs back up to ground level and stepped out through the doors into the daylight, the rain had stopped and the ordinary world was all around me. People hurrying to work and cars in the street and the clean, fresh smell of wet pavement after rain, and it all seemed so impossibly, blessedly far away from the thing that lived in the basement. I handed in my notice at the end of that week. I never gave them a reason, and I never told a single living soul about it, until right now, until tonight. And I'll tell you the thing that has stayed with me longest, the thing that still on bad nights keeps me from sleep. It was not the voice asking me to come down, as frightening as that was. The worst part, the part I cannot escape, was the very end of it. "That's all right. I'll wait," because you see, those words meant that it was not going away, that it was not leaving, that it was still down there, below the building, below the lowest level in the cold and the dark, being patient, still waiting, waiting, with all the time in the world, for someone someday who would answer it, someone who would finally come down. Story 6. This is the last one, and it is the quietest and the gentlest of them all, so please, do let yourself drift now if you feel sleep coming. You needn't hear the end. We finish with a woman working the night shift in a place that is by day absolutely full of people, and yet in the small hours stands completely and utterly empty. A cleaner alone in a vast old museum after closing, moving slowly through the dark and silent halls with her cart and her mop, surrounded on every side by all those ancient, watchful, silent things. And the one night when one of them, she remains certain to this very day, moved, I cleaned a great museum at night for many, many years. A big, grand, old one? The sort of place with sweeping marble staircases and soaring halls and gallery after gallery after gallery of old paintings and older statues and artifacts far older still, things dug out of the earth from civilizations gone to dust thousands of years ago. During the daytime, of course, the museum was full of life, full of people, school groups in their crocodiles of children and tourists with their cameras, and the gentle, constant murmur of the crowds drifting through. But I worked after closing, from 10 o'clock at night until the early hours of the morning, when all the visitors were long, long gone, and the great doors were locked and barred. And it was just me and a small handful of other cleaners spread thin across that enormous building. And all of those old things sitting in the dark. People always ask me the same question when I tell them what I used to do. They ask whether it frightened me, working all alone in a museum at night in the dark, surrounded by all those ancient objects, the marble statues with their blank white eyes, the suits of armor standing empty in the shadows, the painted portraits of the long dead gazing down at you from the walls. And the honest answer for almost all of those many years was no. No, it did not frighten me. Not at all. I found it peaceful. I found it beautiful even. There is a very particular quality to a great museum at night, when the bright lights are off, and only the low security lighting remains, and the vast halls are full of soft pooling shadows, and your own footsteps echo away into the darkness above you, and you feel in the strangest and loveliest way, as though you have all of human history entirely to yourself, as though it has been left in your care for the night. I would push my cart slowly through the silent galleries, doing my work, and I would talk to the paintings sometimes the way you do when you're alone, just murmuring, saying a quiet good night to the old portraits as I passed them. And it never felt frightening. It felt friendly. It felt truly like good company. I was never once afraid, except for one single night, and it was raining. Of course it was raining. A steady, patient rain falling against the tall, arched windows of the gallery, and the soft sound of it filled the great hall as I worked, mopping the wide marble floor of the long portrait gallery, the hall where all the old paintings of people hung. This was a hall I knew better than almost any other. 2 long rows of old framed portraits running down both of the long walls. Grand and serious figures from centuries past. Men and women in their old-fashioned finery, lit dimly and warmly from below by the soft security lights. All of them looking down and out into the long room. I had worked in that hall hundreds upon hundreds of times over the years. I knew every single painting in it. I knew their faces, truly better than I knew the faces of my own neighbors down the street. There was one portrait in particular, hanging near the middle of the long hall, of a woman in a dark old-fashioned gown. A serious woman, unsmiling, with her pale hands folded neatly in her lap and her dark eyes looking calmly and directly out into the room. I had passed her 1,000 times. I had said a quiet good night to her 1,000 times. She was simply a part of the familiar furniture of my nights, a familiar and not unfriendly face in a deeply familiar place. And on this one particular rainy night, as I mopped my slow way down the length of that dim hall toward her, with the rain falling steadily against the great windows, I glanced up at her the way I always did out of pure long habit, and I stopped. I stopped dead, with my mop in my hands and the water dripping from it onto the marble, because she was looking the wrong way. The woman in that portrait, who for 1,000 nights and more had looked calmly and directly out into the room, straight ahead, serene and serious, was looking off to the side. Her head was turned. It was turned upon her painted neck, and her dark eyes were directed away off to her left, down toward the far end of the long hall, toward the dark archway down there that led through into the next gallery beyond. I stood absolutely still on the wet marble, and I stared up at that painting, at that turned head, at those averted eyes, and I told myself instantly and desperately that I was simply mistaken, that I had never truly looked at her closely, that she had always been painted that way, head turned, gazing off to the side, and that I had simply never properly noticed in all my years of passing her by. But I had noticed that was the trouble. I knew that face. I knew it better than almost any face in my life. I knew with total and absolute certainty that it had always looked out, level and direct, into the room, because I had said goodnight to it, eye to eye, 1,000 times over, and now it was not looking at the room at all. Now it was looking away, turned to the side, as though something down at the far end of the hall had suddenly caught its attention, as though it were watching, with those calm, dark, painted eyes, for something to come. And I did the thing you should never do. I followed her gaze. I couldn't help it, you understand. It was the most natural thing in the world, and the most foolish. I turned my own head, slowly, and I looked down toward the far end of the long hall, toward the dark archway that the painted woman seemed to be staring at so intently. And there was nothing there. Of course there was nothing there, just the empty archway, and the deep blackness of the next gallery beyond it, and the soft, endless sound of the rain on the windows. Nothing at all. But standing there in that long, dim, silent hall, all alone with all those hundreds of painted faces ranged along both walls around me, I was suddenly seized by the most overwhelming, the most unbearable, the most absolutely certain feeling I have ever known. The feeling that the woman in the portrait had turned her head to look down the hall because something was coming. Something was even now approaching through that dark archway, something that I could not yet see, and that at any moment now it would arrive and step through into the hall, and that when it did, all the other painted figures, all of them ranged along both of the long walls, would slowly, one by one, turn their own heads to watch it pass. I did not finish mopping that hall. I left my cart standing right where it was, the mop leaning against it, the bucket half full, and I walked. I did not run, because to run would have been to admit out loud to myself just how frightened I truly was. I walked, steadily and quickly, straight out of that gallery and back through the building to the little staff room, and I sat there under the bright, ordinary electric light, with the radio turned on for company, until another of the cleaners happened to pass by an hour or so later, and I never said a single word to her about any of it, because what on earth could I possibly have said? The very next night, I had to go back into that hall, because it was my job and there was no avoiding it, and the woman in the dark gown was looking out into the room again, straight ahead, calm and serious, her pale hands folded in her lap precisely as she had always been for all the years I had known her, as though she had never turned her head at all, as though I had simply imagined the whole impossible thing. But here is the thing that I know, the thing I have carried with me ever since. I worked in that great museum for 3 more years after that one rainy night. And in those 3 years I cleaned that long portrait hall hundreds more times, and never once, in all those hundreds of nights, did I ever again say goodnight to the paintings, the habit of a lifetime gone just like that. And never once did I again let myself look too closely, or too long, at the woman in the dark gown as I passed her, because some part of me, some deep and frightened part, was afraid, every single time I stepped into that hall, that I would glance up and find her turned to the side once more, her head turned, her dark eyes fixed down the length of the hall, upon that black archway, watching something come. And at this time, if I were foolish enough to follow her gaze again, down to the far end of the room, this time there would be something there. And that, my friends, is the last of tonight's 6 stories. 6 people, all of them working alone through the long dark hours while the rest of the world lay sleeping in its beds. Each of them alone. Each of them on one rainy night visited by something that the daylight could never afterward quite explain away. Perhaps it was only tiredness. The mind plays its tricks in the small hours. We all know that, conjuring shapes and sounds out of nothing. Perhaps it was only the great loneliness of the night shift, the human mind rebelling against all those empty, solitary hours. Perhaps it was only the rain, which has always, since the beginning, made us feel things we cannot quite account for. Or perhaps, just perhaps, the night shift really is a little bit closer to something than the daytime ever is. Perhaps in those long empty hours when almost all the world is asleep, the walls between things grow thin and warm, and something slips through. Something that during the bright, bustling, crowded day would never quite dare. I hope, wherever you are, lying there in the dark and listening to the rain, that you are warm and that you are dry and that you're not alone. Or that if you're alone tonight, you do not feel it too keenly. The rain is still falling outside. It will go on falling all through the night, patient and steady and endless. And there is a great and ancient comfort in that, I have always thought, in being held safe and warm inside, while the rain does its quiet work out there in the dark, and the night does whatever the night does. So leave a light on if you'd like. There's no shame in it, and let the sound of the rain carry you gently down, all the way down into sleep. You have nothing at all to watch for tonight. Whatever it is that walks the night shift in the empty buildings and the quiet wards and the lonely roads, it is not your shift to work, not tonight. You can put it all down now. You can rest. Good night. Sleep well. And we will see you again next time the lights go out.